When you send a text, have a conversation, or even just wave at someone across the room, you're communicating. But have you ever stopped to think about how that process actually works? Communication scholars have spent decades trying to map it out, and what they discovered is that communication is a lot more complicated than it first appears. In this mini lecture, we're going to look at three models that help explain the communication process: the linear model, the interactive model, and the transaction model. Together, they give us a fuller picture of what's really happening when we communicate. The first and oldest model is the linear model of communication, sometimes called the transmission model. This model describes communication as a one-way process. A sender encodes a message, meaning they turn a thought into words or gestures, and transmits it through a channel, like sound waves or a phone signal, to a receiver who then decodes it on the other end. Think of a radio broadcast. The announcer in the studio records a message. It travels through electromagnetic waves, and you hear it through your car speakers. The announcer has no idea whether you actually received it clearly, but as long as there's no static in the channel, it probably got through. This model has an obvious limitation. It treats communication as a one-way street. The receiver is passive, just a target. There's no room for feedback and no acknowledgement that context may affect how a message lands. That's where the interactive model comes in. The interactive model recognizes that communication flows in both directions. Participants alternate between the roles of sender and receiver, and critically, feedback is part of the process. When your instructor responds to a question you asked in class, that response is feedback. When your roommate shrugs in answer to your question, that's feedback too. The interactive model also introduces the idea of context. Physical context includes things like the size and layout of a room, the lighting or background noise, all the environmental factors that shape how a message is sent and received. Psychological context includes internal factors like stress, mood, or anxiety. Imagine interviewing for a job in a cramped, overheated room versus a calm, well-lit office. Same candidate, same qualifications, but the context shapes the communication in meaningful ways. The interactive model is a significant improvement over the linear model, but it still treats communication as something that happens in discrete turns. First one person sends, then the other responds. In reality, it's messier and richer than that. That's the insight behind the transaction model. The transaction model argues that communication is not a back and forth exchange of messages. It's simultaneous, ongoing. It's a process in which people are sending and receiving at the same time. Because of this, we drop the labels sender and receiver entirely. Instead, both participants are called communicators. More importantly, the transaction model argues that communication doesn't just convey meaning, it creates social reality. We use communication to build relationships, shape our sense of self, navigate cultural differences, and form communities. To account for this, the model introduces three additional layers of context. Social context refers to the norms and rules, often unspoken, that govern how we're expected to communicate in a given situation. Relational context accounts for the history between communicators. You talk differently with a close friend than with someone you just met. And cultural context includes identities like race, gender, nationality, class, and sexual orientation, all of which shape how we communicate and how others communicate with us. So to recap, the linear model shows us the basic mechanics of sending a message. The interactive model adds feedback and context, and the transaction model shows us that communication is not just a tool we use, it's the process through which we construct our social world. These models give you a framework for analyzing communication situations and for becoming a more intentional, effective communicator yourself.